Hi, this is Brian with Brian Spain Domain, and today we are going to talk about a legend, a famous story in Spanish history, the story of how King Jaime I, James I of Aragon, was conceived. We're not even going to talk much about his life or anything like that, but it was a story that I've come across on numerous occasions in books and in articles, even in videos. And so I've seen it so many times, I decided I'd do a little bit more research about it and share it with you because I think it's a pretty entertaining story. As you know, like any country with a 1,000+ year history, and Spain is a lot older than that, the number of anecdotes around to entertain the history buff like me is countless. And as I was telling you, the story of how Jaime I, the King of Aragon, one of the most famous kings of Aragon, he also went by the name Jaime the Conqueror because of his many military triumphs, came to being. Jaime was born in 1208 in France, in the town of Montpellier, and we'll see why that's important to our story. But first, let's talk about his parents. They had a lot to do with his existence. His father was Pedro II, Peter II of Aragon. He was a young and energetic king who was crowned by Pope Innocent III and given the name the Catholic. He was not the only one. Isabella, the Queen of Castile, and Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, a couple of centuries later, would also earn that name. However, even though he may have been known for his deep religious faith, consistent with the way kings behaved back then, and even today in some cases, he had a reputation for being quite a skirt chaser, taking on numerous lovers before and during his marriage to Maria, or Marie of Montpellier, who herself was an incredibly wealthy and influential woman at the time. She also held vast tracts of land, in the words of Monty Python, in the south of France, in the Occitania region. Through her marriage, Aragon under Pedro would try to exercise more influence in that area of Europe, just north of Aragon. Now, we all know that one of the most important tasks of a king, or was the one back then, was to ensure that they had an heir to the throne, a male heir especially. The Aragonese tradition was based on that. The Castilian tradition was a little bit more flexible. A woman could be a queen if the conditions were right. But nonetheless, Pedro needed to get married, and Marie came up as a candidate. Now let's talk a little bit about Marie. She was born in 1182 in Montpellier. Her life would not be very long. She would die in 1213, so she would only live to be 31. But she had a very active and intense life, an often tragic and sad life. To give you an idea, when she was just 10 years old, she was married to Raymond Geoffrey, a French nobleman known more famously as Barral of Marseille. He was a viscount of that city, of Marseille, but luckily for her, he died the very year they were married. These were, if she was 10 years old, she was, these marriages, these were sort of like the first step towards a more formal marriage. Marriages were generally considered to be formalized when they were consummated, but she was only 10 years old, and since he died, she was able to enjoy a little bit more of her childhood unencumbered by sort of lurking older men. It didn't last very long. 5 years later, she was wed off again, this time to a man named Bernard IV, who was a count. And this marriage lasted a little longer, long enough for Marie to give birth to two daughters. But it turned out that Marie was not Bernard's only wife. Two other women lived in the same home as him and were essentially, he sort of was polygamous. And the teenage bride was probably unable to do anything about it at first, but eventually the Pope intervened and he annulled the marriage at her request, and that was in 1201. Now, 3 years later, she married Pedro II, but before we get to that, it is important to know that Marie, after divorcing her second husband, vied for her right to be the Lady of Montpellier. Her father, William VIII, dismissed that idea in favor of her half-brother, William IX. So when her father passed away in 1202, William, the son, claimed the title, but Marie wasn't about to give in. And with the help of Pedro II of Aragon, she removed her sibling from office, so to speak, and took over. Her marriage to Pedro cemented her position, and it also was a gain for the king, who was looking to have more influence in southern France. The next task was to bring about an heir to the throne, especially a male heir, which according to legend was not an easy task. Now the story goes that Pedro and Maria did have a child at first, a girl, I believe, who died just after 1 year. Then for some reason Pedro repudiated her, or in the very least ignored her sentimentally. Why this is seems to be unclear. She was known to be an attractive woman, fair, that probably would have been the word used back then, a fair lady. But the king apparently took a disliking to her, and he also had a reputation, as I was telling you before, for having many lovers. But the issue of having an heir to the throne was left unresolved, which was something that made the local leaders, the nobility, quite uneasy. Because when you have a problem with succession, it means a lot of instability, and the ruling class doesn't really like that. So they came up with a plan to outwit the king and trick him into having sexual relations with his wife without him knowing about it, or at least he didn't know who she was. Now, for this to happen, they had to count on the collaboration of one of Pedro's assistants in his inner circle. Apparently it was a knight of some kind, who told him that he had arranged for a rendezvous with a lady friend that apparently the king had taken a liking to, and that she would be waiting for him in a bed in a dark room in the royal residence. She insisted that the room be dark. All Pedro had to do was show up and enjoy the moment, basically. And the king wasn't opposed to this idea and agreed to the plan. And so it was that the king ended up sleeping with a woman he thought he didn't know, or barely knew. At least in his mind, he thought it wasn't his wife. But in actuality, he was cheating on his wife with his own wife. And it was all happening under the watchful eyes of some of the most important members of the court. 24 in all, they say. There are some versions that talk about ladies in waiting, the maidens of the queen, plus some of the major advisors and members of the church. Others say it was just important members of the court, different versions of this same story. And they interrupted the scene once it became apparent that the king had finished for the night. We'll leave it at that. Pedro was shocked to see he was surrounded by so many major figures in his bedroom, and logically thought that his local subjects were now rising up against him. In other words, he thought this was a possible coup. Then they pointed to his partner of the moment and said, "Look who you've been with tonight." And then he was doubly shocked for being double-crossed, and probably quite angry by the fact that he had been deceived, even though he was actually deceiving his wife in sleeping with what he thought was another woman. And eventually, though, according to the story, he relented. He said, okay, and announced that now that we know the truth, let's let God's will be done. And so it was about 9 months later, Jaime the First, Aragon's most successful monarch, probably, or at least one of them, was born. Maria paid a price for the ploy. Apparently, Pedro never went back to her again, and her son, Jaime, was ignored by his father for several years at the beginning of his life. Jaime would go on to be known as Jaime or James the Conqueror, like William the Conqueror, Jaime el Conquistador, and he would be famous for taking cities like Valencia from the Moors. But as I was saying, this story is more about how he was conceived, and I'll tell you more about his life at a different time. This is a story that has all the makings of a legend, a myth, but as crazy as it sounds, it's possible that it's true, at least in part. I mean, we know that Pedro and Maria were his parents. We also know that their marriage was more of one of convenience than true love, and that the relationship was known to be very strained and distant. And Pedro himself was infamous for being, as they said in Catalan, molt donat a las dones, or very fond of women in English. And so despite that, and that name of the Catholic, or the sobriquet of Catholic, his conduct strayed quite a bit from that. It may be that he was lured into sleeping with her, but so far there is nothing to confirm that, and the details quite possibly have evolved over the centuries, so we'll quite possibly never know what the truth is. But as I was telling you, it hasn't been ruled out by any stretch of the imagination, and it makes for certainly entertaining history, popular history, and more popular, I think, knowing that it just may be true. Anyway, that is all for this podcast brought to you by Brian Spain Domain. Please feel free to leave us any comments or questions because we love the feedback. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and Castos. Or if you wish to support Brian Spain Domain, we'd greatly appreciate it. We work very hard to provide you with the best information about Spain, Spanish history, and Spanish culture. You can do so by clicking on our PayPal donate button, or if you want to have access to absolutely all of our podcasts and support us regularly, you can check us out on Patreon at the link provided below. And you can also check us out on our YouTube channel and support us by subscribing. Stay well, stay safe, and hasta pronto.